The scratches appeared on camera, not before the filming, not after it, but during. The film crew kept rolling for 9 straight minutes while 3 deep gashes materialized on Tony Pickman's stomach with no visible cause. No hand anywhere near him. Nothing to explain what they were watching happen in real time. Tony wasn't surprised anymore. He'd been living with this for over a year. What surprised him was that it was getting worse. Welcome to Real Ghost Chatter. I'm Marianne Paul, and I'm so glad you're here. What I have for you today is one of the most thoroughly documented cases of paranormal violence in American history. And I want to be upfront with you about something before we begin. This isn't a story about cold spots and flickering lights, although it starts that way. It's a story about a young family, an ordinary Army sergeant and his pregnant wife, who moved into a modest house in a small Kansas river town and encountered something that, by their own account, and by the account of television crews and investigators who witnessed it firsthand, wasn't a ghost. It was something with a will, something that chose a target, something that escalated deliberately the moment it sensed resistance, and something that, in the end, was never truly defeated. Before we get to what happened to Tony and Deborah, I want to share the legend of the house itself. The house at 508 North 2nd Street in Atchison, Kansas, was built in the 1860s for a family named Finney. Dr. Charles Finney used the ground floor as his medical office, seeing patients in a small examining room just off the front parlor. In those days, before Atchison had its first hospital, Dr. Finney was one of the only physicians for miles. The legend says that one late night, around 1906, a desperate mother came pounding on his door, carrying a 6-year-old girl named Sallie. The child was in agony, doubled over, her appendix about to rupture. There was no time to wait and no hospital to take her to. Dr. Finney had to operate immediately. He began the surgery before the anesthesia had taken full effect. Sallie's screams filled the house, and then they stopped. She died on his table, in a house that was never meant to be a place of death, at the hands of a doctor who was only trying to save her. No historical record has ever confirmed that a child named Sallie died in that house. There is no death certificate and no newspaper account. But the legend put down roots in Atchison anyway, and what came next suggests that something in that house had very long roots indeed. It was 1992 when Tony and Deborah Pickman moved into that house on 2nd Street. Tony was a U.S. Army sergeant stationed nearby, and Deborah was pregnant with their first child. They weren't looking for a haunted house. The house was affordable and close to the base, and nothing about it alluded to the horror inside. The first months were ordinary enough. The lights flickered occasionally. The oven timer switched on by itself a few times. It was the kind of small things you explain away in an old house because old houses do that. But one oddity couldn't be explained. Their dog wouldn't go near the nursery. He'd plant himself in the hallway, ears flat, and growl at a room that was empty. The Pickmans told themselves it was nothing and ignored the dog's behavior. Then Taylor was born. Whatever was in that house reacted to the baby's arrival. That's the only way to describe what happened next. Because the previous benign activity didn't ramp up gradually, it snapped into focus. Objects moved, candles lit themselves and left small, perfect burn marks in shapes that had no natural explanation. The phone would go dead in the middle of a call and come back with a low, rhythmic sound on the line that wasn't static. And one night, Tony went upstairs to check on Taylor and found the nursery rearranged. Every stuffed animal in the room had been gathered from the shelves, the crib, and the windowsill and placed in a circle in the center of the floor. He came downstairs and asked Deborah if she'd done it. She hadn't, and neither had her friend who was visiting. 3 adults in the house, and not one of them had touched those animals. Tony stood in the doorway of the nursery for a long moment, looking at that circle. He said it was the first time he couldn't explain the strange happenings away. July of 1993 was when the attacks on Tony began. The first time, they were leaving the house for the evening. Tony felt a sharp sting on his back. When Deborah lifted his shirt to look, there were 3 long scratches, deep enough to draw blood, in a place he couldn't have reached himself. They photographed them. They told themselves it was probably something he'd brushed against without noticing. But it kept happening. The scratches came at all hours, in all locations, and in places on his body that were physically impossible to self-inflict. They appeared on his chest, his stomach, his back, his sides. The scratches always in 3s, and they came without warning. Tony was always the target. Neither Deborah nor the baby were touched. Tony began waking in the night, unable to move. A crushing weight and a dark shape pressed down on him. He started having dreams of being dragged out of bed by his wrists and waking up to find blisters ringing both wrists in the shape of small fingerprints. Tony isn't a small man. Whatever left those marks was strong enough to hold him. It would be easy, reading Tony's account, to wonder if the stress of a new baby and a strange house was catching up to him. Deborah's account makes that reasoning much harder to sustain. Deborah wasn't physically attacked, but she saw things. She watched red welts rise on her husband's skin with no cause, appearing as she stood in the same room, watching. She saw him scratched while he was standing still, mid-sentence, with nothing visible near him. Then, on the morning of October 31st, 1993, after Tony got home from a night shift, he went to the kitchen for a glass of milk and froze because a young girl stood in the doorway staring at him. She was wearing a white dress that looked like it belonged to another century. When she saw him looking at her, she seemed startled and disappeared. Tony dropped the glass and ran upstairs. It was only later that he remembered the dress. Like something from the 1800s, he said. A child's face that looked as real as anything else in that kitchen. That was the first time he saw her clearly, and it wouldn't be the last. The Pickmans called a psychic named Barbara Connor from California, who had no prior knowledge of the house. Barbara walked through the rooms, identified a young girl, and gave her the name Sallie. She told the Pickmans that Sallie didn't like men and that she might have been hurt by a man in her short life. Sallie scratched Tony out of anxiety, not real malice. Her advice was to acknowledge Sallie, talk to her, and include her in the household. Deborah leaned into this completely, talking to Sallie out loud and buying her gift-wrapped dolls. For a time, things seemed to ease slightly, but they didn't stop. Tony came home one day to find the TV remote on the kitchen counter, covered in scorch marks and partially melted from the inside out. It had been in the living room when he left. No fire had been reported, and no explanation was ever found. He was walking past the staircase one afternoon when he felt something strike him hard from behind and shove him into the railing. He spun around. The hallway was empty. And the scratches kept coming, always 3 in a row, deep enough to bleed. They appeared whether Tony acknowledged Sallie or ignored her, whether he was calm or afraid, or whether he was alone or surrounded by other people. Whatever theory Barbara had offered, the evidence wasn't cooperating. By 1994, the Pickmans had been living with this for nearly 2 years, and Tony had reached out to the television show Sightings, one of the most prominent paranormal investigation programs of the era. The crew came to the house, set up cameras, and interviewed Tony and Deborah. And then the cameras caught something that is very difficult to dismiss. During a filmed interview, scratches appeared on Tony's stomach. Not before the cameras were rolling, not after, but during. The crew filmed for 9 uninterrupted minutes as 3 long gashes materialized on his skin with no hand touching him, no sharp object anywhere near him, and nothing to account for what was happening. The scratches bled and scarred, and they were documented on film. The Sightings crew came back to the house 5 times during the Pickmans' residency. Strange events occurred during every visit. A second psychic, Peter James, was called in. He independently identified a girl named Sallie without being told the name. The Kansas Paranormal Group investigated and concluded there was more than one entity in the house. They concluded the scratching and the physical violence wasn't coming from Sallie at all, but from a second, older presence. They said it was a middle-aged woman, described by multiple investigators as far more aggressive and far darker in nature. Some investigators began using the word demonic instead of ghost. Tony himself had already used that word to describe the entity in the house. I want to pause here for just a moment. If you're drawn to stories where the darkness is real, but the light is stronger still, you'd feel right at home in my Raven's Cove Iconoclast series. 6 supernatural thrillers where ordinary people find themselves on the front line of exactly this kind of battle, written in the spirit of Frank Peretti's This Present Darkness. You can find the whole series on Amazon.com, MariannePaul.com, or wherever good books are sold. Now, let's get back to Atchison, Kansas. The Pickmans finally agreed to let a medium attempt a spiritual cleanse of the house. It seemed like the only option left. But when the moment came, Deborah made a request. She asked the medium to leave Sallie. She'd grown attached to the child's spirit, convinced by Barbara's earlier reading that Sallie was benign, maybe even protective of their baby. She didn't want Sallie gone, just the dark thing, just the one that was hurting Tony. The cleanse began, and whatever was in that house didn't receive it quietly. Tony was attacked during the cleanse itself. 8 scratches appeared across his back, the deepest he had ever received, and they didn't come in the usual pattern of 3. Whatever responded to that ritual didn't bother with its usual signature. Interesting that this attack happened during the cleanse, as if the entity was responding to the attempt with a direct message about what it thought of their authority to ask it to leave. And then there were the voices. Tony had been hearing them for months. They were a low, constant pressure at the edges of his thoughts. After the cleanse, they intensified, and he stopped sleeping. He began experiencing blackouts. He'd come back to himself, unable to account for where the time had gone or what had happened. After one of those blackouts, he discovered that a stray cat that had wandered into the house was dead. He'd killed it and had no memory of doing it. Tony Pickman describes himself as someone who would never harm an animal. He said it with the kind of certainty that only comes from deep self-knowledge and deep horror at what had been done through him. That was the last straw. The Pickmans packed what they could and left 508 North 2nd Street without trying another cleanse or calling another psychic. And Tony reported that it wasn't over even after the move. Nightmares followed him. Scratches appeared in the new house. There was a sense of something attached, watching, and waiting. Tony came to believe that what had been in that house had found a way to follow him. He doesn't call it a haunting. He never has. Tony Pickman's word for what lived in that house is demon. And he said, with the kind of specificity that comes from 2 years of lived experience, that he believed a demonic entity had been using the face of a little girl as a lure, presenting itself as Sallie to keep the door open, to keep Deborah engaged and protective of its presence, while it systematically targeted her husband. The house is still there, and it's a tourist attraction now. You can book an overnight stay for $125 a person. Male visitors continue to report scratches appearing on their skin, and the pattern Tony described hasn't changed. The Pickmans tried to get help. They called psychics, invited investigators, and performed a spiritual cleanse with a medium. They tried everything they knew the world had to offer. Nothing worked. This young couple had been traumatized and terrified by an invisible source. They reached for whatever help they could find. We would all do the same. However, I think the fact that nothing worked tells us something important about what they were dealing with. A New Age cleanse carries no authority over a demonic entity. It's a method by which a human being asks something from the spirit realm to please leave. And if what's in that house is what Tony believes it is, that request lands about the same way a polite note would land on someone who has already decided not to go. In the book of Acts, the 7 sons of Sceva tried to cast out a demon using Jesus' name as a formula, without the faith and the authority behind it. The demon's answer was chilling. Jesus I know, and Paul I know, but who are you? This type of exorcism did not end well for the sons of Sceva. You can read that for yourself in Acts chapter 19, verses 11 through 20. The cleanse at the Sallie house went wrong in almost exactly that pattern. The entity wasn't persuaded, wasn't threatened, and it escalated. Because a cleanse performed without real spiritual authority isn't a threat to something demonic. It's an announcement that no one in the house knows how to fight back. There are skeptical explanations for some of what happened in that house. Sleep deprivation, stress, psychological suggestion, and the power of an increasingly terrifying narrative to shape what a frightened person experiences. Those are fair points, but Tony's scratches appeared on camera in real time, witnessed by a professional television crew with no stake in making them real. The Kansas Paranormal Group documented their findings independently. 2 different psychics with no contact between them identified the same child entity by name. Male investigators who visit the house today, knowing nothing about Tony's specific pattern, continue to receive physical marks in the same manner. That's a lot of moving parts for a purely psychological explanation. At some point, the simplest explanation for consistent, physical, witnessed, and documented phenomena is that they are real. What they were and what authority could have addressed them, I'll leave between you and your own convictions. But the evidence that something was there, that it chose Tony, and that it responded to the cleanse by getting worse, is about as well documented as any paranormal case in modern American history. The house at 508 North 2nd Street still stands, a modest two-story building on a quiet Kansas street. Nothing about it from the outside to suggest what it holds. Atchison itself is a beautiful town, the birthplace of Amelia Earhart, full of Victorian architecture and river town history. And nestled into all that ordinary charm is a house that has been doing the same thing to the same kind of person for over 30 years. Tony Pickman went in as a non-believer. He left as a man convinced that the spiritual war the Bible describes isn't a metaphor. It's real, it's personal, and it can come for ordinary people in ordinary houses on ordinary streets. He said that walking into that house shattered his entire worldview. I hope it sharpens yours the way it sharpened mine. The words I want to leave with you come from the letter to the Ephesians, chapter 6, verse 12. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Paul wrote those words 2,000 years ago, and Tony Pickman lived them in a rented house in Kansas in 1993. The battle is real, the darkness is real, and the authority that stands over all of it is real too, stronger than anything that scratched those walls, stronger than anything that left its marks on Tony's skin, and stronger than anything that laughed at a New Age cleanse and called it nothing. That authority has a name, and the darkness knows it. Until next time, may you walk in the light, may your own home be a place of peace, and may you know, whatever you face, that you were never meant to face it alone. God bless.